So everyone have at least a source sheet, or they can share a source sheet? No, this whole second side doesn't have a source sheet. Can you just pass it over to Art? Thank you. Take one for yourself. Do you have one? Okay, good. Tina, would you close the door, please?
Yes.
Because I tend to scream. It's my my claim to fame.
Thank you.
My first rabbinic job was, I'm not recording this yet, my first rabbinic job was in Dayton, Ohio, of all places. And needless to say, I moved there right from Israel, so it was a real culture shock.
They have a flight museum there.
They do. The Wright brothers. Anyhow, so one Shavuos night, since we were talking about Shavuot, they have a Jewish newspaper. So one of the Jewish newspaper reporters went synagogue hopping to do the story about what was going on for the programs on Shavuot night. And so the way he described my presentation was, he said, the Sam Kinison-like Rabbi Shiff. So I have toned down
from that era.
I've toned down since then. Got more mature. Anyhow, so we're here today to speak about an interesting topic because in the news, many news items have revolved around this topic. It's made many front covers of magazines and of newspapers. Would you just close that door, please, Art? Thanks. And so the concept of ransoming someone and paying the ransom is actually a set of ideas and laws discussed in Judaism, and in Hebrew it's called Pidyon Shvuyim. Pidyon Shvuyim, which means redeeming captives. So there's a lot to talk about, and there is very interesting sources, as we'll see, as we'll get to, about these ideas. So the goal, really, of our conversation is to understand the mitzvah, because in Jewish law it's considered a mitzvah to redeem someone who's being held captive by an enemy, and we want to understand the concepts surrounding how, why, and when it's not allowed. So, yeah.
Can you, when you do this, differentiate whether there's a differentiation between redeeming a Jew and a non-Jew also?
We're not going to differentiate. For purposes of understanding the concept, we're not going to differentiate. Obviously, as we've discussed in the past, Judaism's laws generally are talking about Jews. But we can apply the ethical principles to everyone. And that's really what we're going to be doing, is trying to apply the ethical principles to everyone, even though Jewish law wouldn't be mentioning, meaning we wouldn't, Jewish law wouldn't even have the assumption that the Jewish community would have a sense of very specific responsibility to redeem a captive from the general population. Even though Judaism and Jewish law talks about the incumbent responsibility of the Jewish community to redeem its captives, obviously we're going to just extrapolate from there and understand it as it would relate to humanity as a whole, the ethical principles. So it happens to be called, in the works, in the Jewish law books, Pidyon Shvuyim, redeeming a captive, is called a mitzvah rabbah. You know what that means? Mitzvah rabbah? A very big mitzvah, right? When you say todah to someone, you say thank you. When you say todah rabbah, you say thank you very much. So there aren't many things that are called a mitzvah rabbah. Pidyon Shvuyim, redeeming a captive, is called a mitzvah rabbah in the Talmud. So the Talmud asks, what's the source of us knowing that it is a mitzvah rabbah, a very great mitzvah? And the Talmud answers in response to this question by quoting a verse in Jeremiah. You don't have it on your source sheet. I'm just going to read it to you. And this source in Jeremiah is a very harsh rebuke of the Jewish people that Jeremiah is saying in the name of God through his prophecy. So this is what Jeremiah says, and this is chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Hashem said to me, even if Moses and Samuel were to stand before me, I would have no desire for this people. Send them away from my presence and let them go. And if they tell you, where shall we go? Say to them, thus says God. Now listen to this. Whoever is destined for death will die. Whoever is destined for the sword, to the sword. Whoever is destined for famine will be in famine, and whoever is destined for captivity, to captivity. So we have natural death, we have death by the sword, death by starvation, and captivity. So the Talmud looks at this verse and says, you know what this is talking about? This is talking about, it's listing these things in order of its severity, from least to most severe. And so the Talmud, in source number 1 here, says, in this, regarding this verse, it says, of course, natural death is natural death, and then it says, the sword is worse than natural death, famine is worse than death by the sword, and captivity is the worst of all. And because of this conclusion by the Talmud, based on this verse, Maimonides writes that the mitzvah of redeeming captives is actually the most important commandment that comes and is more important than all other things. It takes precedence from all other commandments. So look in source number 2 here on your page. And this is Maimonides, the laws of giving charity. Matanot aniyin means the laws of charitable giving. And this is what Maimonides says. The ransoming of captives takes precedence over the feeding and clothing of the poor. Indeed, there is no greater religious duty than the ransoming of captives. For not only is the captive included in the category of the hungry, the thirsty, and the naked, but his very life is in jeopardy. And one who turns his eyes away from ransoming, he transgresses, and he lists these 10 different commandments written in the Torah that you're transgressing if you do not redeem people who are being held captive by the enemy. So the law is in Judaism that you're even allowed to sell a Torah scroll in order to get money to redeem someone who's being held captive by your enemies. You're allowed to sell a synagogue in order to raise money to redeem the captives of your community. Yes?
Are you allowed to release others who put others at risk?
So that's a good question. So what's interesting about the Bowe Bergdahl case is the news that's been coming out is that he was a deserter. And so the larger question is, regarding that, do we have a responsibility to redeem someone who's being held captive because of his own foolishness? He put himself into danger, or he did something wrong, maybe he's even sinned, and now he's in danger. Do we still have a responsibility to redeem him? Yeah.
Well, 2 things. One, he was mentally ill, and then 2, we could just say, maybe he wasn't drafted. He shouldn't have been drafted in the first place because he was kicked out. He was discharged from the Coast Guard prior to service in the military.
Okay, and that could be very well true. I'm not disputing any of the reasons why he did what he did, or it's actually, as far as Jewish law is concerned, it's immaterial why he did what he did. Judaism, one of these kind of questions was actually answered, and was actually asked in the early 16th century by a rabbi whose name was the Maharam of Lublin, Poland, and he was asked by a specific Jewish community that a young man in their community did something very foolish, and he caused himself to be held captive by some sort of enemy state. and they were going to either execute him or forcibly convert him to their religion. And this community wanted to know, are they responsible for, because of his foolishness, to raise the money from the community in order to pay for his release? And the Maharam of Lublin actually answered that it makes no difference that this person has sinned. It makes no difference that this person even put himself into jeopardy. The fact of the matter is that the community is not exempt from redeeming him, and that they had to use public funds to do so. So, regardless of his of Bowe Bergdahl's intention, or whether he was a sinner, so to speak, or not, is actually immaterial vis-a-vis Jewish law. The ethics of Jewish law would say, nonetheless, if he's in danger, it's incumbent upon the community to redeem him from captivity.
Yep.
Now, obviously, there are some exceptions, and we're going to be talking about those things. Otherwise, we could just say goodbye now. But obviously, the conversation is a little bit deeper than that. Yeah.
Yeah, my question was more focused on when the cost of the ransom endangers the lives of others.
Right. So that's the second side of the coin that we need to talk about, because it wasn't just money that we're talking about. It was the release of terrorists. And so we have to talk about that as well.
And also, a couple of U.S. soldiers were killed trying to rescue him in the past. So I think that's something that should be.
Well,
You're right.
Wasn't part of the
If
ransom.
we were
I
to
know, but in the past, I'm saying it was involved with the whole captivity, though.
right, but if we and the point is well taken. But if we look at what Maimonides says here, there is to be no expense spared, it seems, from doing what's necessary to get that person out of captivity.
All right.
That's what it seems. It takes precedence over every other religious duty, according to Maimonides, which is a very, very important thing to understand. And I just quoted here the Shulchan Aruch, the book of Jewish law, that tells us that every moment of delay when the redemption of captives could be done quicker is comparable to bloodshed. So it's like the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo is telling us that if a community doesn't do this mitzvah, it's as if they killed him. If he dies in captivity, that the blood is on the hands of the community that did nothing to redeem him. So it's a pretty important and big mitzvah. Yeah.
For each of these quotes, you give a source. Can you maybe briefly talk about the role of that source with regard to Jewish law and Jewish behavior? I don't want to create a big digression if it's too much of a digression. But by quoting the Rambam,
Yes.
is it just the opinion of Rambam, or is I'm not? There's this gap in my knowledge. I was bar mitzvah, had a great Jewish education.
Right, but you're not familiar with the classical Jewish sources.
But at that age, it never occurred to me to ask, what's the role of Talmud? What's the role of the philosophy?
You mean you don't trust me?
Yeah.
You don't trust me to give you what I think is the right thing?
Yeah.
The reason why we often quote Maimonides, Rambam, is because he was such a prolific writer, and generally speaking, an amazing codifier of Jewish law in places where other people didn't stand up to that challenge or the task. More times than not, we listen to what the Rambam says. His opinion weighs very heavy in the chain of the process of concluding what the practical law would be. His opinion weighs very, very heavily when we're talking about matters of Jewish law. Obviously, when we want to find the source of all Jewish laws, we either look in the Bible, and as the Bible is extrapolated and understood and interpreted through the eyes and the writings of our great sages of the Talmud. So that in the first source, Bava Batra, is a Talmudic tractate, and we'll see other Talmudic tractates as well. So obviously, what we're seeing here is that it's a huge mitzvah. It's the most important religious duty. If you don't do it, the blood of that captive is on your hands, so to speak, according to our sources. And even if the person who's being held captive, it's his own fault, according to some of our sources, it's still incumbent upon the community as a whole to dip into the community coffers, raise the money from the community, and redeem that person. Okay? So, with all of this information and understanding that the very heavy language that the Talmud and Maimonides and the Shulchan Aruch attribute to this mitzvah, it's shocking that we find in the Talmud itself when we do not redeem captives. It sounds as if there should never be a time when we'd say no. But the Talmud itself says that there are times when we are not allowed to redeem captives. So look at source number 4, which is a Mishnah. It's a Mishnah in the Talmud tractate of Gittin. So what does this say? We do not redeem captives for more than they're worth. Why? For the benefit of society. Okay? And we do not help captives to escape for the benefit of society. So the Gemara asks, what does for the benefit of society mean? Is it to prevent a monetary burden being placed on the community, or is it so that the kidnappers are not encouraged to do it again? So it doesn't actually answer. There's no answer. It's sort of a rhetorical question, meaning the questions that it asks, is it too much of a financial burden on the community to redeem captives for more than they are worth? Or is it because paying the captors will give them incentive to do it again? So in the end, because the Talmud doesn't actually answer the questions, it just poses those two, we come to the conclusion that those are the two reasons why we don't redeem someone for more than they are worth. What does that mean, for more than they're worth? Let me explain. In those times when this discussion was taking place, and it applies to this time of nowadays too, people did not kidnap people for ransom. They kidnapped people because they were worth something on the slave market. That's what people would do. It's happening today. They kidnap people and sell them. So that's really what the Talmud here is talking about. You don't redeem someone for more than what they are worth on the slave market. Why? Because if you pay more money than what they're worth, A, you'll be putting a terrible financial burden on the community, and B, it will incentivize the captors to do it again. They'll be like, hey, we can make some money. So is there a practical difference between these two? There is a practical difference, because if I don't use community funds and I only use private funds, then the burden on the community reason wouldn't hold. It wouldn't be necessary. We would be exempt from that reason to not redeem them. If someone could raise their own money to do it, then we wouldn't care. But nonetheless, the Talmud uses these two reasons as the reason why we do not redeem captives for too much money. So what, in essence, is the basis of these reasons? What's the basis of those two reasons? Yeah.
Sounds like it's a, when you struggle, there's a balancing of benefit versus hurt, in the end.
Right. So what you're saying, and really the basis of these two reasons given in the Talmud, is we have to understand whether redeeming this person will be a menace to the larger society. And this is a very important conclusion that we have to keep in mind as we continue the discussion.
But I mean, that's sort of a utilitarian point of view where it's like, is the harm going to outweigh the benefit, you know? But I mean, does
Well, it's not a matter of whether the harm is going to outweigh the benefit. We're not looking at, is this one person, you know, we've had the discussion in here before, and we've quoted from the Mishnah in Sanhedrin that says, to save a life is to save an entire world, right? Judaism puts great value on every human life. That we know. That we're taking for granted, that we understand that from the Jewish perspective, every human life is of absolute importance. On the other hand, we have to remember that if we're going to compromise every other human life because of this one, then that would be a reason to not do it. If the community becomes impoverished because of this one person, it's tantamount to a menace to society. If the pirates, let's just use the word pirates, are incentivized to kidnap more people, then again, it's saving this one person with extra funds would thereby create a menace to society.
But it hasn't happened yet. You don't know for sure that they're going to do that. Is that enough of a reason that you could?
Well, that's exactly what the Talmud is saying. The Talmud concludes that because it is enough of a reason. We're enough concerned that this will happen, that we're going to say it's good enough. It's a good enough extrapolation or theory that we're not going to allow for the overpaying of the ransom. Okay? So, to sum up the concept of the financial burden and the incentivizing is that the Mishnah explains to us that there is a decree that you're not allowed to redeem people for greater than their market value because of tikkun olam. That's what, for the benefit of society, is the language of the Mishnah in Hebrew is because of tikkun olam, to avoid an inevitable situation that will endanger more people. Okay, and that's a very important conclusion. Creating a situation that will eventually endanger more people, or could endanger more people, is a very important conclusion from that piece of the Talmud. What's an interesting exception is if you look at number 7 here on the other side of the page, is we're worried about creating a menace to society, but if you look on 7, even according to the security considerations, the rabbis did not prohibit a person from redeeming himself for more than his worth. And a person's wife is like himself. So if you have enough money in your bank account and they want, $100 million from you, then you're allowed to empty out your bank account. You personally are allowed to empty out your bank account in order to redeem yourself, but you cannot allow the community to have to overburden itself to redeem you. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay.
I
Yeah.
have one, but I'm sort of lost. It still doesn't only be dealing with money. We're not dealing with.
You're right. I'm making the case.
He's built in his way there.
That's the whole point. Right? People always ask me, why should I learn Talmud? I already know what the law is. I could read the law. Well, there's really nothing like understanding how it develops. Right? There's a beauty of how things develop, and not just to coming to its fast conclusion. I know that in our society we want fast conclusions, but if you wanted just the conclusion, you could have just called me.
Next time.
A or B.
I mean, okay. So what do we do? there's another exception I wanted to talk about. There's a story in the Talmud. There was a man, his name was Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, and he found himself in Rome. Are you asking a question?
I have a question, yeah.
Go ahead.
So it's called, I know there's I think it's in the Talmud, but where you're supposed to make sure that if someone's going to die, and their life is on the line, or someone is going to kill somebody,
Yes.
you have to do whatever's in your duty to make sure that person doesn't kill that person. You also, while you can kill them to stop that, you're supposed to do it in the least violent way possible.
Yes.
Now, I think that has a lot to say in this specific case.
You're right. You're right. That happens to be one of the exceptions. We haven't gotten there yet, but one of the exceptions to the rule of there being a cap on spending is when there is actually imminent life danger. In that the people are not, the captors are not interested in ransom or money, they just want to execute the person. In that kind of situation where you know that the execution is imminent, then it's all bets are off. Meaning you just go straight and do what you can in order to stop that person from dying. That's true, and that is the concept of the rodef. Meaning, if you see that someone is pursuing someone's for their life, then you do what's necessary to stop them at whatever cost, even to the perpetrator's life himself. So you're right, and that it is an exception to the cap on how much we spend and what we do in order to release somebody from captivity.
Doesn't that specifically apply here, especially when we're talking about a capture situation where there's precedent for the executing of our prisoners there?
Yes, it could. It could. It could, yes. There's another interesting exception that I wanted to bring up to you about the story. There was another story in the Talmud about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, who was traveling in Rome at that time, about 2,000 years ago, and he heard about an unusually gifted boy who was being held captive. And he succeeded in communicating with the boy and communicating with the authorities, and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania was so impressed by the sheer knowledge and ability of this student, of this child, that he believed that he should just do whatever was necessary to release this child from captivity, and so he did. He procured this child's freedom at an exorbitant cost, and of course this Talmud says this Talmud grew into one of the greatest rabbis in the Talmud, Rabbi Ishmael. So the commentaries on the Talmud say, how was Rabbi Yehoshua permitted to do such a thing, collect such a high ransom, when we see a direct Mishnah that we just saw that prohibits doing such a thing? So the commentaries give three reasons why he was allowed to do it. The first reason is the child was in imminent life danger, as you said. The second reason is that this child had great potential to become a scholar. And great potential in scholarship is something that we need. It's something we have a shortage of as far as resources go. So we need more scholars, and so scholars are allowed to be redeemed at a higher price, or even the potential scholars are able to be redeemed at a higher price. As if you look on source number 5 here, where the Shulchan Aruch comes and brings this law: captives may not be ransomed for more than their value for the sake of the social order, so that abductors will not be encouraged to kidnap additional victims. But one may ransom himself, as we've seen. One may also offer a large ransom for a sage, or even if he is not a sage, but just a sharp student with the potential for greatness. So we learned that law from the story of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania, and he also said that he also exempted it because he exempted himself from the law because it was the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, and there was no worry that there would be any more destruction, because everything had already been destroyed. So he wasn't worried that there'd be more captives, because everybody was being held captive. So that was his reason. So So that's another exception. But if you look on the top of the back side of the page, I'm sorry, the quote, the source got chopped off, but it says here, when the captive's life is in danger, we offer more than his value. No matter what, we're allowed to offer more than the value of someone who's in immediate danger. There's another reason, which is a very important reason, and that's saving children. Children have a special exception as far as when children are being held captive. Can anybody imagine why that is?
The future of the people?
The future of the Jewish people. Absolutely. So because Judaism holds very, very importantly about the future of Judaism, and that we conclude that children being held captive by, specifically within a Jewish context, Jewish children being held captive by Gentiles is a threat to their spiritual well-being, then Jewish law maintains that saving children from all captivity also is an exception to all the rules, and so everything must be done. You violate the Sabbath, you violate all Torah laws in order to save children who are being held captive. So that's another important exception to the rule. So what do we do in this specific case? We have this man who there is precedent for this enemy to behead and immediately kill its captives. On the other hand, the ransom, so to speak, was the release of terrorists. So what does Jewish law have to say? Do we go to the nth degree in order to save someone who's being pursued by a pursuer, as you mentioned, Steve, and we've seen in the Jewish legal sources? Or do we view it as not allowed because we're releasing terrorists? So if you look at source number 8 here on the back of the page, I've quoted for you a Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Halevi Kilav, who, again, it's just one opinion, but it's an important opinion nonetheless. So let's read this together. Furthermore, it seems that nowadays, when terrorists declare their desire to kidnap and murder Jews, and in fact act upon these declarations without any compassion for the victims, whether men, women, or children, that releasing terrorists is actual danger and is therefore forbidden. This is true even according to those who maintain that the prohibition is based on the burden imposed on the community, since the danger here is tangible and arises immediately upon their release. Added to this is the fact that they join the forces that battle us from their countries with long-range weaponry, and thus represent a threat even if they don't actually penetrate our borders. It therefore seems that it is forbidden to release terrorists and murderers in exchange for captives, not just in exchange of many terrorists for one, but even one for one, because of the future danger. So it seems that this rabbi is coming to the conclusion, based on what we have learned so far, that because the releasing of murderers and terrorists means danger for the larger whole of humanity, it's not worth saving one life for it, because it puts into danger many more lives. What do you have to say?
It's like a korban.
I have a question.
You're
Yes.
sacrificing somebody.
Well,
I think every individual should be like saved if we can help them. I understand the other point of view, but
you're right. You're right, and we want to. The question is, are we benefiting even him? I mean, that person, when he returns back to society, are we benefiting him now by putting the larger society, including himself, back in danger because we've now added more terrorists to the equation. So that's really the conclusion, the sort of accounting that is going through the mind of this rabbi, that even if we do this, this person becomes, he's put into imminent danger along with the rest of our community because of the release of terrorists. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of accounting that's not being done here. Specifically, it acts like if we add more terrorists, that's some kind of a significant change of what's going on. One, not all of the people released were terrorists. Some were members from the Taliban that were specifically a rebel government in Afghanistan. Some of them were terrorists. So, one, it doesn't apply to all the people that were released. And two, I imagine we got lots and lots and lots and lots of value out of them while they were in our prisons for multiple years, and we wouldn't be releasing them if we did not get that value out of that, and that potential to defeat that future threat.
Well, there's two dangers involved. You're putting people in danger by having terrorists who are trying to kill these people, and you're also providing the incentive for them to kidnap more people later on to extract more.
That might apply if we actually were still in Afghanistan, but we're not. And they're the
We still are.
Well,
There's still a limited
actively
presence
fighting,
until
Limited presence, but
2014.
we're not talking about the massive scale that we were on, and we're also not talking about the scale we were when we were reaching that
And
mission.
the conflict extends beyond Afghanistan, but that's another point.
Sure, but
Shai, what was your question?
It's kind of against the whole topic, but
Oh, well.
I apologize in advance. But this rabbi, I don't understand how he can actually rule on the matter. Because just like, for example, this Jewish law says you cannot eat pork. So if a Jew asks, hey, what if I eat a pork sandwich? Do I need to say Birkat HaMazon, grace after meals? But of course you can't rule on something that is forbidden. So there is Jewish law that says you have to put these murderers to death. Terrorists are not terrorists, they're murderers, right? The Jewish law says you have to kill them. How can you rule about something that is forbidden? I mean, there is no question that you should not be released because it's supposed to be killed. Why are you not killing them to begin with? Why even discuss